The life of Dave Rudabaugh was filled with danger, betrayal, and unexpected twists, but no one could have predicted just how far this outlaw would go. Once riding alongside legendary names like Billy the Kid and Doc Holliday, Rudabaugh did not just follow the Wild West's most feared men, he became one of them. From daring train heists to violent jailbreaks and a gruesome end few could stomach, his story is scarier than most people realize. So, who was the real Dave Rudabaugh? And how did he transform from a petty rustler to one of the most feared and most hunted men in the American frontier? But before we uncover the darker side of his story, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell for notifications. Early life and first crimes. Dave Rudabaugh's story did not begin with gunfights or jailbreaks. It started in the quiet farmland of Fulton County, Illinois, where he was born in July 1854. His early years showed no signs of the chaos that would follow. But like so many men of the frontier, the seeds of violence were planted early. When Dave was still young, his father died fighting in the Civil War. This loss affected his family so much that they were forced to relocate to Kansas, a territory known for its volatility, lawlessness, and rapid expansion. That was where David grew up. Life in post-war Kansas was not about settling down alone, it was about survival. As railroads expanded and cattle drives surged through the Great Plains, lawmen and outlaws were sometimes the same people by different names. For a restless, fatherless teenager like Dave, the chaotic landscape of the frontier was both a playground and a proving ground. It didn't take long before he started gravitating toward trouble, and trouble welcomed him with open arms. By his late teens, Rudabaugh had moved beyond boyhood mischief. He began rustling cattle and stealing horses. These two events were both high-stakes crimes in a region where livestock was wealth. But he did not do this alone. He worked alongside others who would also become infamous, including Milton Yarberry, who later became a city marshal and was executed for murder, and mysterious Dave Mather, a gunfighter known for operating on both sides of the law. It was in this world, half outlaw, half opportunist, that Rudabaugh found his footing. But it did not end there. Rudabaugh was not just another cowboy trying to make a dishonest living. He was a strategic criminal. Unlike some outlaws who relied solely on brute force, Dave was cunning and calculating. He studied how the system worked and how to exploit its weaknesses. His jobs became bolder. He targeted stagecoaches, freight wagons, and eventually turned his attention toward the more lucrative, riskier business of robbing trains. But before that leap, he was honing his skills in the lesser-known corners of the West, learning how to ride hard, shoot straight, and disappear. It did not take long for Dave's name to circulate in outlaw circles. He was not yet famous, but he was known, especially among lawmen who were beginning to piece together the crimes trailing behind him. Stories began to swirl that Rudabaugh never stayed in one place long, that he could vanish into the prairie like smoke, and that he had no loyalty to anyone but himself. Even at this early stage, Dave was developing the cold, survivalist instinct that would define the rest of his life. Eventually, Dave's early crimes started catching up to him. It started when a particular stagecoach he robbed belonged to companies that had government protection. Cattle he rustled were linked to ranchers with political clout. So just like that, the small-time crimes that once slipped under the radar were now drawing the attention of serious lawmen. But if Rudabaugh feared capture, he didn't show it. Instead, he increased his dubious activities, and this time, he started expanding his circle of fellow outlaws and planning bigger, riskier heists. Dave Rudabaugh lived such a wild and dangerous life at a young age that many people still wonder why he chose that path. Some say it was because of his situation. He grew up poor in a tough land where life was hard and choices were few. Others think it went deeper, that maybe he had a dark side. Maybe he liked the feeling of danger, wanted power, or simply didn't care about the rules. We may never know the full truth, but one thing is clear. Rudabaugh didn't become an outlaw by accident. He wanted that life. It wasn't just about money. He seemed to enjoy the freedom of living on the run, the fear he caused, and the fame that came with being known as a wanted man. By the late 1870s, Dave Rudabaugh was no longer just a local thief. He was on the verge of becoming a national problem. He had gained enough experience, connections, and confidence to move beyond Kansas and Arkansas. He was not interested in hiding anymore. He was ready to make a name for himself. And what came next? Train robberies, alliances with legends, violent shootouts would forever seal his place in the history of the American West. But it all truly started with one fateful decision: the plan for a high-stakes train robbery that would either make Rudabaugh rich or get him killed. Curious to find out what happened next? Stay tuned. The trio and the first big heist. Like we said earlier, by the late 1870s, Dave Rudabaugh was not just another thief moving from town to town. He was ready to step into the big leagues. He had the skills, the cold nerve, and most importantly, the right partners. Around this time, he joined forces with two other hardened outlaws, Mike Rourke and Dan Dement. The three formed what would become known as the Trio, a loosely organized gang with one goal, and that goal was to take on bigger targets, make bigger money, and earn bigger reputations. This trio was so dangerous they set their sights on one of the boldest moves an outlaw could make, that is, robbing a train. Unlike cattle rustling or stealing from a stagecoach, a train robbery was loud, risky, and guaranteed to make headlines. It was not just about money, it was about sending a message. And for Dave Rudabaugh, that was the point. He did not want to hide in the shadows anymore. He wanted to be feared, known, and talked about from town to town. Rudabaugh wanted his name to echo across the frontier, and nothing did that better than hitting a train. So, the plan was made. On January 22, 1878, near Kinsley, Kansas, they made their move. It was bold, dangerous, and exactly what Rudabaugh had been chasing all along. On paper, it looked solid. The train was loaded with valuable cargo, and its route passed through a relatively isolated stretch of land, a very perfect place to plot an ambush. But luck was not just on their side. Immediately, they started to rob things and began to fall apart. The main problem was that the gang was not as organized as they believed, and the resistance they encountered was far more aggressive than expected. The heist was chaotic, messy, and ultimately a failure. The outlaws got little to no money, and worse, they had drawn the full attention of the law. And that was when things started to take a different turn. Stay tuned. The failed robbery caught the eye of one of the West's most respected lawmen, called Bat Masterson. Bat is known for his cool demeanor and quick draw. Masterson was not going to let a train robbery go unanswered. He launched a full-scale hunt for the culprits, and Rudabaugh's name came up quickly. It didn't take long before he was tracked down, captured, and thrown in jail. His outlaw career could have ended right there, but Rudabaugh had no intention of rotting in a cell. In a move that would define the rest of his life, Rudabaugh made a deal with the authorities. The deal was simple. All Rudabaugh had to do was to testify against his own gang in exchange for leniency. It was a bold, cold decision, but it worked. He avoided serious punishment and walked free while his former partners faced prison. It was a turning point. From then on, Rudabaugh was no longer known not just as a ruthless outlaw, but as someone willing to turn on anyone to save himself. Before he even got back, the news of the betrayal spread quickly. Among fellow criminals, Rudabaugh's name was used to describe disloyalty to others. To lawmen, he was still a dangerous figure, but now also seen as someone who could be useful. He existed in a strange space between criminal and informant, feared by both sides. The failed robbery and his cooperation with the law marked a shift, not just in his tactics, but in the way people viewed him. Dave wasn't just an outlaw anymore. He was unpredictable, untrustworthy, and deeply dangerous. So, after the failed robbery, Rudabaugh did not disappear like many thought he would. Instead, he simply changed his approach. As he was no longer part of a permanent gang, he began moving across state lines, hiring himself out to whoever needed a gun, and did not ask too many questions. He took part in the Colorado Railroad Wars, where rival companies used hired guns to sabotage each other's tracks and intimidate workers. Rudabaugh fit right in. He was a man who thrived in chaos and got paid for it. One thing became clear. As time went on, Dave Rudabaugh had a pattern. He would commit a bold crime, get caught, and then find a way out. Sometimes he escaped from jail. Other times, he turned on his partners to cut a deal, but one way or another, he kept slipping through the cracks. Once free, he'd disappear for a while, only to pop up again in a new place, using a fake name or riding with a different gang. He was always on the move, always changing, always one step ahead. Some people said he was lucky. Others called him clever. He was not the fastest gun or the most feared name in the West at that time, but what made him stand out was how hard he was to catch and how easily he could switch sides when it suited him. The failed train robbery, his betrayal of Rourke and Dement, and his time as a hired gun did not make Dave Rudabaugh a household name, but they set the stage. These events placed him squarely between the worlds of law and crime. He was now tied to respected lawmen like Bat Masterson, while also moving deeper into the criminal underworld across several territories. He had money, he had weapons, and more importantly, he had no illusions left about loyalty. Trust was a weakness he could no longer afford. By this point, Rudabaugh had become a man shaped by violence, betrayal, and constant movement. He knew how to survive, and he was willing to do whatever it took to stay ahead. He wasn't famous yet, but the pieces were in place. Then came a turning point. Nothing could prepare Dave Rudabaugh for what came next, crossing paths with someone who would change everything. A man whose name already echoed across the West like thunder, Billy the Kid. Keep watching because this is where the story gets darker. Dodge City Gang and Rise in New Mexico. After the failed train robbery and his betrayal of former allies, Dave Rudabaugh did what he did best: disappeared. For most outlaws, that might have meant a quiet end, moving into obscurity. But for Rudabaugh, it was just another reset. He re-emerged in Las Vegas, not the neon lights of Nevada, but the volatile railroad boomtown of Las Vegas, New Mexico. It was the early 1880s, and Las Vegas was one of the wildest, most violent towns in the West. Perfect for a man like Dave to reinvent himself yet again. In Las Vegas, Rudabaugh joined the Dodge City Gang, a notorious group of outlaws and corrupt lawmen who ran the town through intimidation, extortion, and murder. At its head was Hoodoo Brown, the so-called Justice of the Peace, a man who used the law as a shield for crime. This gang was not just hiding in shadows or living in camps, they held official positions. They were the law, and Rudabaugh didn't just fit in, he thrived. With the Dodge City Gang, Rudabaugh helped run one of the most openly corrupt criminal networks in the Old West. They robbed stagecoaches, extorted local businesses, and controlled the courts. If someone crossed them, they could be fined, jailed, or disappear entirely. The gang operated with near total immunity because many of its members were sheriffs, deputies, or justices. You see, in Las Vegas, crime did not just happen in the back alleys, it happened in the courthouse. Rudabaugh's role in the gang went beyond muscle. He was used for the dirtiest work, that was to intimidate people, lay ambushes, and do killings that could not be traced to official members. He carried out hits with brutal efficiency, and his willingness to kill without asking questions earned him a reputation even among killers. There was no hesitation in Rudabaugh's methods. He was not in it for justice. He was in it for power, and now, for the first time in his life, he had it. But here comes the twist. One night in April 1880, everything changed. Rudabaugh, along with another outlaw named John Joshua Webb, was involved in a dramatic attempted jailbreak. The plan was to break their comrade out of a Las Vegas jail. But the job went south fast. In the chaos, Deputy Antonio Lino Valdez was shot and killed by Rudabaugh. It was a turning point. Up to this point, Rudabaugh had mostly been known as a thief and opportunist. But now he had murdered a lawman in cold blood. The killing of Deputy Valdez crossed a line that could not be erased. The people of Las Vegas, already tired of the Dodge City Gang's hold on their town, were now calling for justice. With the political tide turning, even Hoodoo Brown could not protect his men anymore. The gang began to splinter. Some fled, some were arrested. And Rudabaugh, now a wanted killer, was forced to run. Again. Despite his notoriety, Rudabaugh had gained something in Las Vegas that would follow him for the rest of his life: respect from other outlaws. He had gone beyond small-time rustling or robbery. He had become a violent enforcer with connections, ruthlessness, and a name people whispered. When Rudabaugh showed up in a town, people noticed. Lawmen feared him. Outlaws admired him. And somewhere in New Mexico, a young gunman named Billy the Kid was watching. In the months following the Valdez murder, Rudabaugh drifted south, eventually arriving in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, a place that was filled with wanted men, fugitives, and ex-gunslingers. It was here that Rudabaugh met Billy the Kid, the most famous outlaw of the era. The two struck up a partnership that made everyone in the region scared. For a brief moment, the two most unpredictable men in the West rode together, and when they did, bloodshed usually followed. So, why did Rudabaugh actually fit into Billy Kid's gang? The reason is simple. Billy the Kid's gang, already wanted for killings tied to the Lincoln County War, was not just looking for firepower, they wanted survivors. Men who would not flinch, men who knew when to shoot and when to run. Rudabaugh fit that description perfectly. Unlike Billy, who still had a strange charm and a loyal circle of friends, Rudabaugh was cold, distant, and violent, but he brought experience, connections, and fear, and that made him valuable. As part of Billy the Kid's gang, Rudabaugh was not just another gunman. He became Billy's equal in terms of reputation. In fact, there were rumors that Dave Rudabaugh was the only man Billy the Kid truly feared. Whether or not that's true, it says a lot about the kind of man Rudabaugh had become. He wasn't just feared by lawmen, he was feared by outlaws too. That kind of reputation only ends one of two ways, with a rope or a bullet. The murder of Deputy Valdez had made Rudabaugh a wanted man, but now, as part of Billy the Kid's gang, he had a second target on his back. Sheriff Pat Garrett, a man that was obsessed with bringing down the Kid, now had Rudabaugh in his sights too. The law was closing in, and this time there was no corrupt judge, meaning no safe haven for him, and definitely no betrayal deal that could save him. Although Rudabaugh had escaped countless arrests, sold out partners, murdered lawmen, and ridden with legends. But the next chapter of his life would take him face to face with one of the most relentless lawmen in frontier history. What followed was one of the most famous captures of the Old West, one that would seal Rudabaugh's fate forever. Don't go anywhere, because this is where the story takes a different turn. The final ride of Dave Rudabaugh. With Sheriff Pat Garrett hunting him down, Dave Rudabaugh went into hiding. He moved from one town to another, trying to stay one step ahead of the law. But by late 1880, he had run out of places to run. He was wanted across the West for serious crimes, murder, robbery, and several bold jailbreaks. Lawmen were growing tired of chasing him. His name was well known, but not in a good way. Then, just a few days before Christmas, everything came to a head. Pat Garrett and his posse tracked Rudabaugh and his gang, including Billy the Kid, to a remote hideout in a place called Stinking Springs. Garrett and his men surrounded the cabin. There was no way out. A short but intense gunfight broke out. One of their gang members, Charlie Boder, was killed during the fight. With no hope of escaping, Rudabaugh, Billy the Kid, and the rest of the gang gave up and surrendered to Garrett's men. Rudabaugh was taken back to jail, and this time things looked worse than ever. He was given 99 years in prison for robbing U.S. mail. Even more serious, he was sentenced to death for killing Deputy Antonio Valdez. While Billy the Kid made headlines with his charm, shootouts, and escapes, Rudabaugh stayed quiet. But he wasn't giving up. He had no plans to die behind bars. In jail, he was not alone. Locked up with him was another outlaw, John Joshua Webb, who had once been a part of the Dodge City gang. The two became close and started planning their escape. In early 1881, they made their move. During the escape, they shot and killed the jailer, Thomas Duffy. After that, they ran into the desert and disappeared. Once again, Rudabaugh had escaped from the hangman's noose. But this time, he did not go north or return to the U.S. frontier. Instead, he crossed the border into Mexico, where American lawmen had no power. For a while, he stayed hidden in the state of Chihuahua. He lived quietly, gambling, and doing whatever he could to survive. For a few years, things were calm, but in February 1886, Rudabaugh's luck finally ran out, not in a famous gunfight, but during a card game. The details are unclear, but something went wrong. A fight broke out, guns were drawn, and Rudabaugh was shot and killed. His head was taken off. The people in the area knew who he was and feared him, even in death. They cut off his head and placed it on a pole in the town square of Parral to send a message. Rudabaugh may have been dead, but his violent reputation still scared people. After years of running, robbing, escaping, and surviving, Dave Rudabaugh met a brutal end. He had spent his life breaking the law, and in the end, the lawless world he lived in finally caught up with him. So, what do you think about the wild life and even wilder death of Dave Rudabaugh? Was he a ruthless survivor playing a brutal game, or just another outlaw who went too far? Do you think he would have survived in the modern world? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more raw, untold stories from the American frontier. Then click on the next video on your screen, because if this outlaw tale had you hooked, you're going to love what's coming next.